One of the things you got to say about Zoom conferences, we can keep things on track because people don't get, don't wander off and get distracted too much. Very good. So welcome back. We are now going to have our second panel. So the title of today's panel is Fellini's Inspirations and Collaborations. We have 4 speakers plus Daniela Bini, whose paper you saw could watch on YouTube, is also going then to join us for the question and answer session at the end. Let me introduce the first speaker. I'd like to remind the speakers that we have you have about 15 minutes for your paper, and then, as I said, we'll have a half an hour Q&A. The first speaker is Mirko Tavoni, who is professor of Italian linguistics and Dante studies at the University of Pisa. He has worked on the comparative history of linguistic ideas in the Renaissance. His main research is Dante, and which is published extensively, including an edition of the De Vulgari Eloquentia and the volume Qualche Idea su Dante, published in 2015 by Il Mulino. He was a winner of the Humboldt Research Award in 2017 and has carried out research on the visionary dimension of the Divine Comedy at the Freie Universität Berlin, out of which came the volume Dante, la dimensione visionaria tra Medioevo e prima età moderna, edited with B. Huss. The title of his paper is Fellini, Dante, Il Viaggio di Mastorna and the Dreams. Professor Tavoni. You're on mute. Professor Tavoni, you're on mute. Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Perfect. Hello to everybody, and thank you very much. As you have just heard, I'm a dentist and not at all a specialist of cinema studies. Authoritative film historians and Fellini scholars claim that Fellini was deeply influenced by Dante, and even that La Dolce Vita and 8½ must be considered the most important transposition of Dante's poem in 20th century cinema. The most evident manifestation of this critical trend is this international conference organized in Ravenna in 2015 with the eloquent title Fellini and Dante. I think you don't, I haven't shared my, yes, now. Can you see my shared screen now?
Not yet.
Not yet, yes. Now?
It's starting, yeah. Okay.
Yes, fine. The most evident manifestation of this trend is this international conference organized in Ravenna in 2015 with the eloquent title Fellini and Dante, the Beyond or the Afterlife of Vision. These are the programmatic statements that can be read in the introduction and presentation of the conference proceedings. As we can see, the solid belief that Dante's vision represents a sort of inspirational subtext of Fellini's films is taken as the basic thesis of the conference. The conference will bring together Dante and film critics to finally compare the various specifications of this critical hypothesis. Naturally, all the speakers of the conference share this programmatic thesis. Among these, let me show as particularly significant this paper by Giampiero Brunetta, a very authoritative scholar, and a very explicit title, The Most Representative Apostle of the Dantean Verb on the Screen. And the image on the side of the article displays the idea well. I have found no less than 20 scholars who have strongly supported this thesis over the past 40 years, while some others have shown greater caution in this regard. I confess that I am very skeptical of Dante's fundamental importance for Fellini in these terms. The salient themes of this alleged affinity, the descent into the underworld of contemporary society, the saving role of a beatific woman, the writer's meta-literary reflection on his work in progress, etc., are certainly not exclusive themes. And Fellini is not an intellectual artist, indeed programmatically anti-intellectual. He is a man of cinema who is very opposed to the transfer of contents from high literature to the cinema. Italo Calvino rightly pointed out that Fellini never lost his popular communication matrix, even when his language became more sophisticated. In this regard, look at the continuity between his early work as a cartoonist for humorous newspapers and as a draftsman in preparation of his films in the 1950s. For example, The White Sheikh, 1952, or La Strada, 1954. This graphic world of popular print media retains its visual authority in Fellini's career until the end. The Giulietta Masini area of Fellini's imaginary world will remain faithful to the graphics of the humorous cartoons from La Strada up to Juliet of the Spirits, which is the film of the sinking into aneurysm, and which, however, maintains an explicit figurative and chromatic reference to the cartoons of the Corriere dei Piccoli. And this popular graphic style will continue in the Book of Dreams, Il Libro dei Sogni, the diary of Fellini's daily dialogue with his unconscious, on which he will work for 30 years, from 1960 to 1990, from La Dolce Vita to The Voice of the Moon until the end. An important Italianist and Dante scholar and translator, as well as a poetess, who was at the same time a friend of Fellini, was a staunch supporter of Fellini's alleged Dantism, Jacqueline Risset. Here you can see a selection of Dante's translations of Inferno, as you can see, Purgatorio and the Rime, and two of her essays on Dante. And here you can see the refined booklet dedicated to her friend Federico and released in 1994, a year after his death. Jacqueline was so convinced of how important Dante was for Fellini that she wanted to convince Fellini too, who, however, did not want to be convinced, in a dialogue not devoid of some comic aspect. Here we see the drawing Viva Jacqueline, drawn by Fellini on a paper napkin at a birthday dinner for Jacqueline. We see the cake with candles on the table and Dante behind Jacqueline's back, who crowns a poetess. In his 1995 book, Federico Fellini, there is a hilarious story by Fellini about American producers who obsess him to convince him to make a film about Dante's hell at all costs, with terrifying visions. And under this offensive, what does he think? He thinks of Jacqueline, who speaks with exalted fervor of Dante and of the ethical, poetic, fatal reasons that lie at the roots of an enterprise which he, Federico, is not allowed to refuse. Only you can do it, she says to the puppet, because he represents himself as a puppet, who, disheartened and resigned, repeats his objections for the 100th time. He doesn't remember anything about Dante, he says. He didn't even like him at school. At the gymnasium in Rimini, he says, there was a black bust of Dante who looked like a spy. We were all convinced that it was him with those thin lips like blades who was telling the teachers about everything we were up to during recess. And in fact, the only sure memories of Dante in Fellini's films belong to the school Dante, or the Dante of popular culture. In Amarcord, the Laurier narrator, located in the center of the town square, tells us about Rimini and its history, and he affirms with rhetorical prose, from the divine poet Dante to Pascoli to D'Annunzio, numerous are the high wits who have sung this land, etc. But the nice little speech is cut off, but a scornful rattle launted by a schoolboy hidden in the shadows. And in the shop of the prosperous tobacconist, there is this Dante advertisement of phosphoril, pills for the brain, as you can see on the left. Fellini has repeatedly stated that the first film he saw at the age of 6 in his father's arms at the Fulgor Cinema in Rimini was Mastorna in Hell, an extraordinary parody full of stunning special effects for the time, and that he was struck by it forever. All my filmography, he said, is already in that film. Here are 2 frames of that Mastorna in Hell. The hell that Fellini liked was this. And this reminds me of Italo Calvino's judgment on Fellini's indulgence, his stopping before any harsh moral condemnation. Both the province of I Vitelloni, says Calvino, as much as the Rome of the cinema milieu in La Dolce Vita and 8½, are circles of hell, but they are also at the same time enjoyable countries of cuccagna, what cannot be said of Dante's Inferno. But one could say, for almost 30 years, from 1965 until the end, Fellini wanted to make a film about the afterlife, the journey of G. Mastorna. It is the most famous film never made in the history of cinema. He didn't shoot it, but for almost 30 years, he worked on its screenplay, involving Dino Buzzati and Brunello Rondi, as we see in the frontispiece of this French edition of the screenplay, but then rewriting it entirely in its own end, which he never did for any other film, as we see here in the posthumous edition released in 1994. Fellini was certainly obsessed with this film for the whole second half of his life. It is the story of a musician, a cello player, who dies in a plane crash, but does not realize he is dead and lives an endless nightmare with no way out in a bureaucratic world governed by unknown and absurd rules. Here, we don't have time to say practically anything about Il Viaggio di G. Mastorna. We can only take a look at the double page of the Dream book at the date of September 9, 1978, in which Mastorna presents itself to Fellini in a distressing dream. And we can take a look at some of the plates from G. Mastorna's journey, drawn in comics by Milo Manara. In fact, Fellini, having acknowledged that he would never make the film, asked Milo Manara to make a comic about it. And here we see some tables by Manara on the left, flanked by very detailed drawings by Fellini, who told him exactly what to draw without leaving him any freedom. Here the protagonist is still Mastroianni, Fellini's eternal alter ego, and this is the opening scene of the story. The plane crashed in the Alps, and the passengers are all dead, but they don't realize it, and they believe they made an emergency landing in the central square of a city like Cologne in front of its Gothic cathedral. Here the passengers, transported to a motel to spend the night, watch a belly dance show that ends with the dancer giving birth. Here Fellini changed his mind. Mastorna is no longer Mastroianni, but Paolo Villaggio, to give the character an awkward and melancholy face. Well, what is Dantean about Mastorna's journey? Absolutely nothing. Or rather, just one thing. Several Beatrices, called by this name, benevolent hostesses or assistants who try in vain to help Mastorna to get out of the absurd universe in which he finds himself imprisoned. Dario Zanelli, a friend of Fellini's, in this little book of 1995, brings back the idea of Mastorna even to the years of high school, when Federico already dreamed of making a book about the afterlife in order to argue, in controversy with Dante, that in the otherworldly realms that perfect order would not exist, but the same mess that we have here on Earth. Apart from this possible high school prehistory, it is clear that Fellini's afterlife is not the Dantean afterlife, but a Kafkaesque afterlife. G. Mastorna's journey is a clear transposition of Kafka's The Trial into the afterlife. Fellini must have read the novel in this translation by Alberto Spaini, published in 1951. Not surprisingly, to write the screenplay, Fellini asked for help from Dino Buzzati, the most Kafkaesque of Italian writers of the mid-20th century. Likewise, it is evident that it is a Jungian afterlife. Just note the obsessive repetition of the terms identification and individuation, the constant request to provide proof of one's true identity. From this afterlife, it is not possible to leave because it is not possible to provide valid identity documents. This request, expressed with these words in bureaucratic language imitating Kafka's The Trial, is the key request of any Jungian analytical psychology, the purpose to which the psychotherapeutic path, and more generally, the inner search of the human being protracted throughout his life. Get to identify yourself. A direct confirmation of this pair of cultural reference, Kafka and Jung, decisive for Fellini starting from the early 60s, comes from the words of Fellini himself in this interview with Goffredo Fofi and Gianni Volpi, recorded in 1993, a few months before his death. If we had time, this paragraph that you see, Jung and Kafka, would have to be read in its entirety, so much is it clarifying. It says that these two authors were decisive for him, Fellini, in his small, almost total healthy ignorance, he says of himself, because they really suggested a way of looking at things that before them we could not identify. From a cultural point of view, Jung for Fellini means, above all, this book, released in 1965, but from a personal point of view, it means the encounter with this psychoanalyst, Ernst Bernhard, whom, in turn, we see represented from the cultural point of view in this book, and whom, from the much more important point of view of what he meant for Fellini, we see recalled in this page of the Book of Dreams, dated November 30, 1960, which marks the beginning of Fellini's analysis with Dr. Berner, who invites him, you see on top of page, to engage in the analysis by telling him, Mr. Fellini, do we want to work seriously? This analysis, which finds its daily documentation lasting decades in the impressive Book of Dreams, is the background of all of Fellini's film creation from 8.5 onwards, under the concept of creative unconscious, as the title of this booklet says, in which the authors highlight how the analysis, in addition to having been a path of knowledge and personal well-being, was viewed by Fellini also, and perhaps above all, as an aid for artistic creation. Finally, in a few minutes, I want to say something specific that, in my opinion, Dante and Fellini have in common. Both Dante and Fellini have a very rich dream visionary streak. In the case of Fellini, this is unanimously recognized. It is even commonplace. In Dante's case, much less. But recent research has shown that Dante too has a very rich dream visionary streak. See the proceedings of this seminar recently held at the Italian Centrum of the Freie Universität Berlin on Dante and the visionary dimension. Dante had this dreamlike visionary vein perfectly active from his young age, as shown by his youthful work, De Vita Nuova, which tells of his love for Beatrice, his Florentine contemporary, from the age of 9 until her death occurred at the age of 25. Dante's whole life in this long period from childhood to adolescence to youth is dominated by dreams, daydreams, hallucinations, delusions, and mystical visions. He tells them and artistically orders them into the magical number of 9 dream visionary phenomena throughout the book. These phenomena are very important for the young Dante, but he does not know how to explain them. He doesn't understand what sense they make. He fears that they don't make any sense. He considers them pathological phenomena, a sign of weakness. Only 10 years after writing the Vita Nuova, after his life was dramatically changed with exile, he abandoned all reverie and immersed himself in the study of philosophy. And then he found in the philosophical and theological text the theory of divinatory dreams and prophetic dreams. That is, the theory that dreams can be bearers of important truths and are not the result of weakness, but on the contrary, they are the privilege that belongs only to the strongest and noblest souls. The page in which we realize that Dante made this discovery is the page of the Convivio, his philosophical treatise. In this passage, Dante says that divinatory dreams exist, that they truly reveal the future to us, and that the existence of divinatory dreams is proof that the soul is immortal. Dante has made this discovery thanks above all to 2 Aristotelian philosophers and theologians, the doctor of the church Albert the Great, and the Islamic physician and philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the Latin word as Avicenna. At this point, Dante knows, because 2 high philosophical and theological authorities have revealed it to him, that his dreams have a very high cognitive value, even a prophetic value. And so he is ready to begin his journey into the afterlife, that is, the dream vision during which God will show him hell, purgatory, and heaven. This is what this 14th century miniature from the incipit of the Divine Comedy tells us, showing us sleeping Dante who dreams the dark forest. The cultural authorities who revealed to Fellini the very high cognitive value inherent in his dreams, as we have seen, are Ernst Bernard and Carl Gustav Jung. Starting from this cultural discovery, Fellini will be able to free all his dream potential. The first exploit to this potential will be the impressive 8.5 opening sequence which Egon Egoyan told us about yesterday in such and inspired way. Thank you.
Thank you for Professor Tavoni, and we will move with no further ado to the second paper, saving, of course, questions and comments and the discussion for the end of the session. The second speaker is Giuliana Minghelli, who is an associate professor of Italian and film studies at McGill University. She's the author of In the Shadow of the Mammoth, Italo Svevo and the Emergence of Modernism, and of most recently of Cinema Year Zero, Landscape and Memory in Post-Fascist Italian Film. She edited The Modern Image, Intersections of Photography, Literature, and Cinema in Italian Culture, and co-edited with Sally Hill, Stillness in Motion, Italy Photography, and the Meanings of Modernity. In 2014, she curated an exhibition on Italian colonialism at Harvard University entitled In Africa, It's Another Story, Looking Back at Italian Colonialism. The title of her paper today is Fascism, Memory, and the Visual Between Federico Fellini and Renzo Piani. Professor Minghelli.
Grazie Luca for the introduction. Nice seeing you. Nice seeing everybody once again. So I have to apologize, meaning I'm throwing this reflection out there. I find that both there is a rich dialogue both with Atto Megoyan's presentation yesterday and with Professor Burke's rich and compelling presentation today, and hopefully we will be able to discuss points raised. I'm focusing on Marco work. So I'll start by sharing the screen. There, I'm reducing this. Okay, so the title of the paper today is L'Arcord, Fascism, Memory, and the Visual Between Federico Fellini and Renzo Renzi. So memory looms large in Fellini. Critical studies have pointed out how memory for Fellini is more a revelation than a process, a posture toward time rather than a willful and conscious act of reconstruction. Recently, Andrea Minuz has described this posture as a mixture of euphoria for modernity and nostalgia for a mythical past, at once archaeological, autobiographical, and physiological. This dance between temporal levels, while it engages memory, arguably sidesteps history. Renzo Renzi's 1975 essay, Open Letter to Fellini, Il fascismo involontario, a proposito di Amarcord, interrogates Fellini's act of memory. The essay is both a critical reading of the film and an autobiographical critical reconstruction of Renzi's and Fellini's shared sentimental education under fascism. It is animated by a sense of historical urgency, that not enough had been said about fascism, particularly at the time in the mid-70s of impending fascist violence. We have reasons to share this sense of urgency. Amarcord's representation of fascism, along with Renzi's reading, may prove illuminating for our times. The relationship between Fellini and Renzi was long-standing. Deeply involved with cinema, one of the founders in 1967 of the Cineteca di Bologna, Renzi was among Fellini's early supporters and one of his most subtle critics. Renzi's analyses were often embraced a posteriori by Fellini in discussing his own films. And I couldn't not quote the critic in 8½, that might present elements that recall Renzi. Is caricatured in the film, his notes, suggestions are read and discarded, and yet eventually recuperated. They will be used for the film. So collaborations, as Federico Pacchioni has recently argued, were crucial to Fellini's filmmaking process. Collaborative script writing with the likes of Pinelli, that you see here, Flaiano, and Pasolini, was marked by a sense of complicity in a shared realm of dreams and nostalgia tempered with self-irony and satire, a shared collective memory that contributed to Fellini's imaginary. Against this notion of collaboration, Renzi's essay on Amarcord evokes a different one, involving labor, elaboration, working through. Memory is not a simple repository of content to work with. For Renzi, it is a process that brings about confession with the materiality of the past. To Fellini's intransitive Amarcord, I remember, a pure act of memory with no object, and as Professor Birch suggested, with no real subject, Renzi opposes the Bolognese Amlarcord, me lo ricordo, I remember it. Fascism and what he calls involuntary fascism that defined the lives of his generation, those who were in their 20s in 1940. For this generation, the relation to memory, a private autobiographical memory, hopelessly enmeshed with history, is inescapable. We started living on memories when we were 30. What does it mean to say that Fellini remembers fascism but does not remember it? Memory as imagination is put into dialogue with memory as witnessing. It intrudes between the self and memory. Amlarcord. Renzi notes, 1, it introduces a pause, an occasion for reflection. 2, it is an invitation to concreteness, a focus on an object. And finally, the labial ml recreates the feeling that one is licking memory like a wound, thus questioning any pretense of critical detachment. The gist of Renzi's reading is the following. Fellini's 1973 remembrance of fascism coincides with the level of consciousness of the majority of people who lived then. The film, he notes, remains within the apparent counterculture of the disimpegno of the 30s, while dilating it, enlarging it to a phenomenon. Here, Renzi notes, lies the great contribution of the film. The general consensus about Fellini's film, the immediate recognition of the world represented, suggests for Renzi a disquieting fact that the consciousness of fascism is still the one originally developed under fascism itself. Additionally, the specific visibility of fascism, even the way to look at it, and he mentions the scene of the celebration of the 21st of April, is one inherited from the regime, a frozen fascism that people carried within themselves as, quote, the intrinsic experience of a whole community, quote, close quote. This, Renzi concludes, redeploying a term that Pasolini was using in those years to denounce the deleterious effects of Italy's modernization, is the true anthropological mutation, one that is inscribed on the body of Pasolini himself and their whole generation. Amarcord is the film of continuity, a film as important as La Dolce Vita for pointing to a subterranean condition of our country. Fellini, talking about his position toward the world of his youth, wavers between distance and closeness. In the film, he says, there is a distance, a judgment, and rejection. But that is not all. It is a little more complex than that, because all of this is accompanied by nostalgia. Elsewhere, however, he rejects the touch judgment as a little inhuman. And he says, the province of Amarcord is a place where we are all recognizable, myself above all. In the ignorance that got us all confused. Immense ignorance, massive confusion. Fellini is suspended between distance and closeness, a position that could be described, to borrow a term that he had used to define his relation to the metaphysical, as an ambiguous adherence. The camera position toward the world, the memory world of Amarcord might illustrate this posture. In a letter to the designer Geleng, Fellini described his idea for the film poster as follows, and I quote, "All the characters of the film should look out of the poster to stare at the spectators. They should, these characters, be as if suspended in startled immobility, lovable, reluctant, and shameless, like an old image, indelible and fabulous, reflected in a cheery Sunday mirror." The aesthetic evoked is the one of the photographic portrait, a fixed stare suspended in immobility, potentially deadening, yet transfigured by reflection in an animating, cheery mirror, in this case, the magic of color and cinemascope. This visual effect described for the poster is also at work in Amarcord's cinematography, where the moving image constantly flirts with the stillness of photography. As frontal take, I'll give you a couple of examples. As medium, the presence of the photographer, and portrait making that recurs different times in the film. These are photographs that appear immediately after the picture taking. Another picture moment. And in freeze frames, this is not exactly a freeze frame, but they're sort of sustained stills and moments within the film. So photography is present throughout the film. Returning to the opposition mentioned by Atto Megoyan yesterday, we could say that the film hesitates between photographic insistence and cinematic fluidity. Renzi connects this intermediality between cinema and photography to Fellini's unresolved position toward the past. And I quote, "You said yourself," Renzi wrote, "that in order not to compromise yourself sentimentally, you shot the film as a series of fixed pictures with few camera movements so that you could maintain distance, transforming the screen into a frozen theater of marionettes standing under the sky of a faraway power, almost abstract, let's say metaphysical, where fiction could be often made apparent." But the frozen quality of photography, uncanny and reflective, in Fellini's Amarcord is corrected by the cheery mirror of the moving image. We are out of the picture, but the picture winks at us and lures us in. And this is just one moment in which there is this complicity between the film and the spectator. Renzi's 30-page mix of cultural criticism, memory, autobiography is interspersed with 25 photographs, a carefully curated photographic sequence of the fascist ventennio that implicitly questions Fellini's visual memory in Amarcord. Photography is integral to Renzi's critical reading, creating the critical pause that forces a confrontation with the materiality of the image. This gesture is crucial to a reflection on fascism. The importance of details, Renzi notes, is much greater in a country where the effectual reality differs from the appearances, the facts from the words, close quote. The photographs in Renzi's essay, with their flat and unrhetoric banality, enact another level of defamiliarization of the inherited visibility of fascism. The images challenge identification and understanding of what Italy and the Italians under fascism were like. What do we actually see? Photography insists, focuses on it, evoking a visibility that defies the spectacle of fascism. Fellini denounced this spectacle and paradoxically duplicated it, as if in a cheery mirror. He makes us at home in memory, his memory, a collective memory. But quoting Freud, memory is a foreign territory. You can hardly feel nostalgia for it, a space at once banal and uncanny. Fellini's image of memory in Amarcord is enhanced by Renzi's act of memory. The two gestures are hardly exclusive. This dialogue makes us reflect on the relation of fascism to visuality and how an inherited regime of visibility stood and still largely stands unchallenged in Italy's memory process. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Professor Minghelli. And right on time. Let me introduce the next speaker then. The next speaker is Russell Kilbourn, who is a professor in English and Film Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. And he specializes in film theory, memory studies, comparative literature, and adaptation. Dr. Kilbourn has published many book chapters and journal articles, and his books include Cinema, Memory, Modernity, the representation of memory from the art film to transnational cinema, The Memory Effect, the remediation of memory in literature and film, and co-edited with Eleanor Tai, the latter was co-edited with Eleanor Tai, and W.G. Sebald's Postsecular Redemption Catastrophe with Spectator. His next book, The Cinema of Paolo Sorrentino, Commitment to Style, will be published by Columbia University Press in 2020. Kilbourn is also one of the founders of the Posthumanism Research Network based at Brock University and Wilfrid Laurier. And his current research interests include posthumanism, the post-secular, and Inuit cinema. The title of his paper is Christ's Return, Political Subjectivity and Post-Secular Film Style in Fellini and Sorrentino. Professor Kilbourn?
Thank you very much, Luca. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
I'm going to, I'll just point out that bio is old now, and so the Sorrentino book has been out for a couple of months, which is a good thing. Anyway, I'm going to share my screen so that I can turn on my PowerPoint. Okay. There we are. Can you, and then I'll go full screen with the PowerPoint so you have something to look at.
Great.
Is that, there we go, should be there in a moment. All right, so this is just coming up for me here. There we are. I had to cut my introduction and my conclusion and my thesis from this, so I hope this makes some sense. Just want to fit into the time. Apart from some of Sorrentino's works, are you seeing the posters right now? Or there we are. Apart from some of Sorrentino's works, I will briefly reference some key scenes from Fellini's films prior to 1965. After this period, with films like 8½" and Juliet of the Spirits, his films become increasingly studio-bound, self-reflexive, sometimes quasi-autobiographical, as we all know, more inside than outside. And none of this is bad, but a discussion of Fellini's later films in relation to the post-secular would be a very different thing. In the earlier works, Fellini's aesthetic retained traces of a neorealist engagement with social reality on the one hand, and genre film on the other. The earlier Fellini's political engagement, or impegno, is somewhat easier to see, I think. In comparison, where Sorrentino's only link to neorealism may be the commitment to style I've elaborated elsewhere as the subtitle of my book. Certain of Sorrentino's works engage productively with genre convention in a distinctly 21st century context, in which I argue questions of faith return with a seeming sincerity that might have shocked the modernist Christian humanist Fellini of La Dolce Vita. Very briefly, This paper originally was to begin with the opening of La Dolce Vita, where famously we see the statue of Christ, either the Christ the Redeemer or Christ the Worker. There's some dispute about his identity wafting over Rome, the Rome that's rapidly being constructed in the suburbs, followed by that famous, incredible sort of smash cut to the Indonesian mass dancer in the nightclub. Second, I'm talking about the sort of returns, various returns of Christ from my title. In The Young Pope, by contrast, Sorrentino, in, sorry to give things away, but in Belardo's Pope Pius XIII's dying vision, if he's dying, but the last thing he sees at the very end of the series is, of course, this cloudy, what seems to be a cloudy vision, the image of either Christ the Redeemer or perhaps the Virgin Mary. Again, the jury's sort of out on that, although it does make a big difference as to which figure he's seeing in the clouds. We can come back to that. And finally, Christ returns again at the end of Sorrentino's Loro. In post-earthquake Aquila, the setting is 2009. In the aftermath of the earthquake, it appears that Berlusconi has made good on one of his promises to give them their Jesus Christ back. That's a line from the film, "We want our Jesus Christ back," which means that they want their statue of Christ deposed from the cross, rescued from the ruins of the cathedral in Aquila. And that is the sort of penultimate scene, is a long take of the statue being lowered to the ground, culminating in this sort of close-up on the statue, which is a very different Christ from the Christ the Redeemer in the other films. At any rate, one starting point for a discussion of the post-secular in film is Gilles Deleuze's ambiguous contention in his second cinema book, The Time Image, that the task of modern cinema is to restore our belief in the world. This points to Deleuze's championing of an immanentist over a transcendentalist perspective. My thesis is buried in here somewhere. But it's arguable that the discussion of the post-secular begins much earlier, before the term is coined, in a 1951 essay by André Bazin, who was, of course, a major influence on Deleuze. In Cinema and Theology, Heaven Over the Marshes, Bazin reviews Augusto Giannina's Cielo sulla palude, Heaven Over the Marshes, a lesser-known neorealist work from 1949. Giannina's film dramatizes the life of the exceptionally pious teenage peasant girl Maria Goretti, who, while living in the Pontine region with her family at the end of the 19th century, was murdered after nearly being raped. In 1950, she was canonized, becoming one of the youngest Catholic saints. Bazin says of this film, Heaven Over the Marshes is a rarity, a good Catholic film. Bazin grounds his evaluation in a close analysis of film style. As he argues, Giannina's film never shows Maria performing a single miracle. Her most miraculous action in the film is to forgive Alessandro, just skipping ahead to the film here, to forgive Alessandro, her would-be rapist, on her deathbed as she lays dying of the wounds that he inflicted. In this scene, Giannina stages faith as a mass spectacle. He marshals this huge crowd of extras dressed in period clothing. They fill the street outside, spill into the hospital foyer, the staircase, the corridor outside of Maria's room. They pack the screen as they await her death, as if she were already a saint. She's on the verge of sainthood, and as she breathes her final breath after forgiving her attacker, the crowd, starting at the front, and there's this ripple of kneeling. All these really hundreds of people kneel in succession, move in this ripple that moves backwards. It's an amazing scene. Soon after this, Fellini will do the same. But in an increasingly critical fashion. Bazin's reading of the film inaugurates a distinction between two kinds of religious film, one of which perpetuates the status quo through the exploitation of familiar stylistic strategies and generic tropes. Bazin calls this the priest or nun story, a subgenre whose international vulgarization, he says, we owe to America. The other kind of religious film, like Heaven Over the Marshes, can be called postsecular in a more productive sense, a kind of film that, especially when it presents religious material directly, hedges its bets, avoiding any attempt to represent the unrepresentable. Italian cinema offers a particularly rich field for the study of the current postsecular moment, if only because of the historical conjoining of religion, Catholicism, and politics, Marxism versus fascism, and so on. As representative of two different generations of Italian filmmaker, both Fellini and Sorrentino have been discussed in relation to the modernist and postmodernist phases in post-war Italian culture and after, but scholars are only beginning to address their respective relation to the postsecular. Cinematically, the postsecular has been defined in terms of a spectrum of contemporary films, from those that offer thoughtful meditations on faith to those that give voice to a non-triumphalist atheism. Fellini's Christian humanist approach, as Peter Bondanella puts it, appears to exemplify the second tendency. La Dolce Vita, for instance, is openly critical of such Catholic tenets as the existence of God and the possibility of salvation. The story of Heaven Over the Marshes, to return to this film for a moment, presents the paradigm of the undeserving man saved by a woman who then quite literally dies. Maria was canonized in 1950 after the film is made, Giannina's film. But her attacker, Alessandro, in historical fact, eventually entered a monastery and died in 1970. He also attended Maria's canonization ceremony, incredibly. So Alessandro's act is quite literally redeemed by Maria's sainthood. This obviously raises issues, all sorts of issues about gender and power that go well beyond a discussion of the postsecular in film. In the final scene, however, of Sorrentino's La Grande Bellezza, Giuseppe Gambardella is metaphorically saved by his memory of Elisa, his first love, his Beatrice, if you will, whose death happens off-screen at the film's start. Like Alessandro, Giuseppe is also undeserving of redemption, although he's mainly guilty of embodying a certain type of man, a masculine subject that, for lack of a better label, I call Sorrentinian. Giuseppe's relationship with Elisa in the film comes down to the final shot reverse shot sequence in which Elisa is purely an aspect of this complex flashback. This scene is intercut with Suor Maria, as we just saw, La Santa, crawling up La Scala Santa di San Giovanni in Rome towards her savior. However, adding a layer of, this adds a layer of complexity that brings this sequence into the realm of the postsecular. The theme of salvation is literally inscribed in the scene, although the impact is largely to reflect ironically on Giuseppe's character, who remarks in voiceover here, "What lies beyond, that is not my concern." But La Grande Bellezza is not a nuns and priests story. As Marco Vanelli notes in his essay on Fellini's film language in the New Wiley Companion, he remarks that the close-up actually isn't a major trait in Fellini's films before 8.5, which remains one of the best examples of his use of this technique. As Adam McGowan reminded us yesterday, it is with 8.5 perhaps that Fellini really launches onto his non-realist mode of studio-based film production, if I can put it that way. Before this film, his use of the close-up, Fellini's, is more sort of classical, with the glaring exception of the famous final shots in La Dolce Vita, Nights of Cabiria, La Dolce Vita, of course, the young Paola on the beach, and at the very end of this period, 1965, Juliet of the Spirits. These close-ups, and this is something that Frank Burke has written on very illuminatingly, Marguerite Waller also, I can't get into their discussions right now. These close-ups work differently though, focusing the viewer's attention on a character, not least because the character's or the actor's attention seems to be focused on the camera/viewer. It's also noteworthy that all of these characters are women, and this is really where Frank's talk today is very helpful, Marguerite's work, and also yesterday's panel on gender. This all connects us in some way to the theme in The Young Pope. Sorrentino's The Young Pope. I have to skip over these examples. Of the relative significance of God / Christ versus the comparable significance of the Virgin or Madonna as narrative elements and even as aspects of the mise en scène. In the series, The Young Pope, each of these seems to represent the respective principle of gender-based power. But one of the most interesting aspects of Lenny Belardo as a character, Jude Law's character, Pope Pius XIII, is his peculiar gender fluidity in terms of specific gender stereotypes, how he moves across the 10-part series from his initially retrograde return to a kind of pre-Vatican II value system to a more compassionate, loving personage. This shift has been read in terms of Old Testament values giving way to those of the New, but it could as readily be characterized in terms of a shift from a more masculine to a more feminine position. This, of course, begs all sorts of questions about gender essentialism and stereotypes, but then these questions originate in the series itself. Right now, I'm just opening the can of worms. In The Young Pope, the themes of redemption and salvation are presented seriously, like the miracles that Lenny performs. As we see here, my screenshots show the straight cuts between Lenny praying fervently to God, to the Virgin Mary in this scene, you must, and then intercutting with Esther having sex with her husband, the Swiss guard, in a window that Lenny can actually see at this point. And in his dialogue, we hear over the scene this sort of repetition of you must. So over the series' 10 episodes, Lenny prays to the Virgin of Lourdes, as it happens, and makes an infertile woman pregnant, as we see here. She gives birth 9 months later. He prays to God and makes an evil nun die. Later on in the series, he prays to God and brings a dying woman back to life in episode 9, as we see here. And the iconography couldn't be more explicit, I think. This sequence, as I've analyzed elsewhere, exploits overtly melodramatic features, deliberately manipulating the viewer's emotions, including the use of soundtrack music. Finally, Lenny also recounts at the beginning of the series to Don Tommaso, the confessor, that during the papal conclave, he prayed to God to let him be elected Pope. You must have me, I must be elected Pope. In each of these scenes, the editing, cinematography, mise-en-scène, all of these things make the causal connection clear between Lenny's intercession and the miraculous results. It's worth comparing Fellini's treatment of equivalent phenomena in his pre-1960s films. Both La Strada and Cabiria, for instance, contain long sequences midway through in which the heroine gets caught up in a religious procession, typically focused on the cult of the Madonna. Here we see La Strada, Cabiria, and so on. In La Strada especially, Giulietta Messina as Gelsomina is inserted into what appears to be an authentic procession in a real town in Italy, adding a documentary element to the film, that the kind of thing that is really lost in Fellini's later work. Not that that's a bad thing. Things begin to change in La Dolce Vita, however. See, for example, here, the what I call the Lying Children of the Madonna sequence, a complex set piece staged in an actual location, but already displaying what would become Fellini's trademark level of directorial control, which he then turns around and mocks in 8½, a few years later. Unlike his earlier films, here Fellini connects the critique of a religious event as media spectacle to all the other media spectacles in the film, especially Sylvia, the Swedish-American actress who arrives to be greeted by the famous paparazzi. There on the right hand, we see the character Paparazzo, who gives his name to what becomes paparazzi. So this is really a central thing in La Dolce Vita, of course. Sorrentino does something equivalent in The Young Pope, incorporating a media critique into his depiction of sort of supernatural events. Although the episodes with Tonino Pettola complicate this theme. And I'm just wrapping up here. If, despite the evident sincerity of his faith, Tonino Pettola is a charlatan, why does he have to disappear? He's made to disappear by a cabal of cardinals working for the Pope. Pettola to one side, or rather, we will never know what happens to him, but we can speculate as to the motive. Petola to one side, Lenny's miracles are presented as real, as a function of generic tropes, the gradual melodramatization of the series. And it's meaningful when, in the new Pope, the latest series, Lenny can no longer perform these miracles once he wakes up after a 9-month coma. Ultimately, this kind of scene becomes a way of indirectly showing Lenny's interior life as a pope, a strategy one might productively compare and contrast to a film like Juliet of the Spirits. But I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kilbourn.
Here we are.
Let me just let you unshare.
Did I unshare? I think I stopped sharing.
I'm still seeing, yes, yeah, okay. Perfect, thank you. Okay, well, let me then introduce the fourth speaker today, or in this session. Our fourth speaker is Marina Vargau, who received her PhD from the University of Montreal, where she also taught in the Department of Comparative Literature, Art History, and Cinema Studies. She has published extensively on the relationship between art and media, on the city and the flaneur in cinema and literature, and on Federico Fellini. The title of her paper is La costellazione del Viaggio di G. Mastorna all'incrocio tra arti e media. Dr. Vargau?
Buongiorno, mi sentite?
Perfetto.
Sì? E mi vedete? Allora,
sì.
Comincerò subito. Scusate. Questo. Vedete anche il mio schermo? Sì?
It looks frozen to me. Hope maybe it's on my end.
Mi sentite sempre? Sì? Sì?
La sentiamo, ma non vediamo. Almeno io ho lo schermo del tutto oscurato.
Posso iniziare?
Prego.
Ok. Sì? Ok, perfetto. Allora, prima di tutto vorrei ringraziare calorosamente gli organizzatori che, malgrado le difficoltà, hanno fatto possibile questo convegno che festeggiano il centenario della nascita di Federico Fellini. E vorrei anche dedicare il mio intervento alla memoria di Marguerite, di Ottavio e di Vladimir Krzyzewski, comparatista e italianista. Allora, per i prossimi 15 minuti vi inviterò in un viaggio interstellare attraverso la costellazione del viaggio di G. Mastorna. La mia intenzione è dimostrare come paradossalmente, a causa della sua irrealizzazione cinematografica, il viaggio di G. Mastorna è diventato l'oggetto più prolifico dell'opera felliniana, provocando la nascita di una costellazione interarziale ed intermediale. Il percorso di questo progetto felliniano è sinuoso, attraversando varie arti e media. Si materializza prima come scenario, si manifesta dopo come riferimento esplicito nel documentario Block Notice di un regista e nel fumetto Viaggio a Tulum, e si trasforma finalmente in fumetto, risultato della collaborazione con Manara. La storia del viaggio è possibile rintracciarla nelle varie versioni della sceneggiatura scritte da Fellini insieme a Brunello Rondi e a Dino Buzzati a partire dal 1965 ed anche nella lettera che Fellini scrive a Dino De Laurentiis. Ecco un rapidissimo riassunto della sceneggiatura originale. Dopo un misterioso incidente aereo, un violoncellista, che inizialmente avrebbe dovuto essere interpretato da Marcello Mastroianni, arriva in una città senza nome e strana, conosciuta e sconosciuta nello stesso tempo, una città mosaico fatta di tasselli che appartengono alle città reali, Roma, Venezia, Napoli, Rimini, Colonia. E dopo vari incontri strani e certe disavventure, Mastorna capisce che questa città non è altro che il territorio dell'aldilà e che lui sia morto. Oltre a prendere degli appunti e riscrivere la sceneggiatura, come al solito Fellini disegna scene e costumi. Poi sceglie anche gli attori e fa costruire certi elementi della scenografia negli studio di Nocità. E tutto sembra finire qui. Le disavventure del più famoso film non fatto della storia del cinema, come l'ha definito Vincenzo Molica, sono ben note. L'avvertimento di Gustavo Roll, la strana malattia che ha colpito Fellini, i problemi con il produttore, l'incapacità di Fellini di lavorare negli studi cinematografici di Dino Città, oppure la sua paura e la sua assenza di fiducia nel progetto delle quali parlava Mastroianni, sono tra le cause possibili che hanno impedito la finalizzazione di questo progetto. Ma dopo queste disavventure, invece di abbandonare il progetto, Fellini ci ritorna prendendo altre strade. Nelle sequenze con le quali inizia il documentario televisivo Block Notice di un regista, filmato nel 1967, si possono vedere la scenografia fabbricata per l'incipit del film, che riproduce il Duomo di Colonia, alcune prospettive della piazza e la fusoliera dell'aereo. E qui per la prima volta nella sua filmografia Fellini si mette in scena, aggiungendo in maniera esplicita una dimensione metacinematografica al suo lavoro. La camera sta filmando in una serie di panoramiche le sagome del film non realizzato, folli rovine abitate dagli hippies. E subito dopo viene inserita l'unica scena filmata del viaggio, in cui vediamo Mastorna, interpretato da Mastroianni, di spalle, camminando nella piazza, mentre che la voce di Fellini spiega, cito, queste strane, allucinanti costruzioni dovevano apparire all'inizio di un film che volevo fare e non ho più fatto. Si chiamava Il Viaggio di G. Mastorna. Le costruzioni sono rimaste così inutilizzate e deserte in uno stabilimento cinematografico vicino Roma. In questa piazza doveva atterrare un aereo dal quale sarebbe sceso l'eroe del film, un violoncellista morto, e da questa piazza sarebbe cominciato il suo viaggio attraverso un paesaggio assurdo da incubo. Nella prossima sequenza del documentario, la camera filma Fellini che, come un archeologo, esplora con Marina Vargau, la sua assistente, i resti dei set abbandonati in un grande magazzino, descritto dal regista stesso come una specie di cimitero degli elefanti, un cimitero di scenari, di disegni, di costumi. Verso la metà del documentario, alla fine della sequenza in cui Fellini e i suoi collaboratori rendono visita a Mastroianni, il regista si ricorda il provino con l'attore suonando il violoncello. All'inizio del flashback, la camera filma Mastroianni di spalle, il posizionamento dell'attore facendo il raccordo tra il presente e il passato. Subito dopo Fellini inserisce nel documentario le immagini col provino. Nelle 3 sequenze consacrate al viaggio, grazie al montaggio e ai raccordi simbolici molto lavorati di punto di vista tecnico, immagini, suoni, musiche, Fellini introduce sempre la confusione temporale tra il presente del filmato e il passato che rinvia a Mastorna, rendendo anacronistici le immagini, gli edifici, oggetti, corpi, visti, gesti, i suoni, il vento, il rumore dell'aereo ed anche le musiche. L'ultima volta in cui Fellini si rivolge direttamente al progetto è nell'agosto 1992, quando pubblica la prima parte del fumetto Il Viaggio di G. Mastorna detto Fernet, realizzato con Milo Manara. Con rispetto alla scenografia ci sono dei cambiamenti notevoli. Il violoncellista con le apparenze di Mastroianni diventa più di 25 anni dopo un famoso clown che assomiglia a Paolo Villaggio, il cui numero principale è di suonare il violoncello. Sul fumetto Fellini scriveva Il viaggio di G. Mastorna detto Fernet, che viene tradotto in questo fascicolo, è sempre un film, solo che è a fumetti. Le matite, gli inchiostri di china, le mezzetinte, i pennelli dell'amico Manara sono l'equivalente delle scenografie, dei costumi, delle facce degli attori, degli arredamenti e delle luci con i quali racconto le mie storie nei film. Alla fine di questa prima parte di 3 previste da Fellini e Manara, a causa di un errore tipografico, invece di continua, viene scritta la parola fine. E, come annunciato dal mago Roll, realizzare Mastorna, anche camuffato in un fumetto, è stata l'ultima cosa fatta da Fellini, che muore il 31 ottobre 1993. A parte questi tentativi di Fellini per materializzare il viaggio di G. Mastorna, il suo effetto attraversa la sua filmografia, mostrando una volta di più la coerenza della sua opera omnia. Da una parte nel scenario il regista riprende varie immagini, temi e personaggi dei suoi film realizzati prima del 1965, dall'altra i fluidi di questo progetto si ritrovano nei film ulteriori di Fellini e in una sua pubblicità. Primo a riconoscere la fecondità del progetto è stato proprio Fellini. Qui c'è una citazione di Federico Fellini. Alla fine di ogni film, il suggestivo fantasmone si ripresenta come per chiedermi di essere realizzato e ogni volta accade qualcosa che lo fa riaffondare, glorioso relitto nelle profondità abissali dove giace e da dove prodigiosamente continua a mandare fluidi, correnti radioattive che hanno nutrito tutti i film che ho fatto al posto suo. Sono sicuro che senza il Mastorna non avrei immaginato il Satyricon, o almeno non lo avrei immaginato così come poi l'ho realizzato, né il Casanova e nemmeno la città delle donne, e anche E la nave va e Prova d'orchestra hanno un piccolo debito con Mastorna. La cosa strana è che quella storia, pur essendosi generosamente dissanguata in tanti miei film, rimane miracolosamente integra nella sua struttura narrativa, non si è rimpicciolita né scarnificata ed è sempre la più attuale di tutte le storie che posso immaginare. Non so far chiarezza sullo strano destino di questo film. Forse non è nemmeno un film, ma un monito, uno stimolo, un racconto guida. Forse ha la stessa funzione di quei battelli che conducono fuori dal porto i transatlantici. Qualcosa, insomma, nato non per essere fatto, ma per permettermi di fare dell'altro, una specie di uranio creativo inesauribile. Quasi tutti gli studiosi che hanno analizzato il viaggio hanno messo in luce questa idea. Ottavio Ciro Zanetti ci ricordava che questo film, lo cito, destinato a non apparire mai sugli schermi, è diventato una sorta di laboratorio di idee ed emozioni per altri film. Dopo la scomparsa del regista, il Viaggio di G. Mastorna continua a emettere le sue correnti radioattive alla costellazione interna, aggiungendosi i documentari dedicati da vari realizzatori, una mostra e uno spettacolo teatrale. Il documentario Deragliamenti, realizzato nel 2011 da Chelsea McMullan, che abbiamo avuto il privilegio di vedere nell'apertura del convegno dedicato a Fellini nel 2013, è un'intervista fatta a Milo Manara sulla collaborazione con Fellini. Chelsea ha fatto la scelta di mettere insieme al montaggio delle immagini fisse e delle immagini in movimento, delle immagini che riproducono le tavole del fumetto, delle foto con Manara o anche delle immagini filmate direttamente nei stabilimenti di Nocità, dove in quel momento ci si conservavano ancora qualche sede di Mastorna, ed anche immagini con Manara lavorando nel suo studio, oppure immagini filmate davanti alla cattedrale di Colonia. Il documentario Il viaggio di G. Mastorna, esperimento di ricostruzione realizzato nel 2013 da Marco Mion, Lorenzo Corvi e Pietro Izzo, è un rubamatic, cioè uno storyboard montato con delle immagini rubate ad altri film. Secondo i realizzatori, il loro rubamatic autoprodotto è, cito, un collage di immagini prese dalla rete che montate insieme potessero dare un'idea dell'atmosfera del film. Il punto di partenza per i tre realizzatori è stata la sceneggiatura del film. Al testo scritto si sono aggiunti tutti i documenti esistenti su Mastorna, le foto realizzate da Tazio Secchiarolli sul set, le immagini di Mastorna recuperate nel block notes di un regista, le tavole realizzate da Manara nel fumetto ed anche alcuni disegni fatti di Fellini che si ritrovano nel libro dei sogni. A questo materiale i tre cineasti aggiungono brevi estratti dagli altri film di Fellini, dove si è manifestato anacronisticamente l'effetto Mastorna, c'è Giulietta degli Spiriti, Satirico, Notte e Mezzo, Amarcord, Roma, Lo Sceicco Bianco, Intervista, Le tentazioni del dottor Antonio, Agenzia matrimoniale, Tre passi nel delirio, Toby Dammit. Di più, per completare con immagini il racconto, vengono inseriti altri estratti dei film realizzati da altri registi italiani o stranieri: Antonioni, Bolognini, De Sica, Rossellini, Pasolini, Scola, Méliès, Spielberg, Tim Burton, eccetera. Ci sono ancora estratti dai documentari e serie televisive, estratti dai libri. Nel 2017 alla Galleria d'Arte Moderna di Viareggio, Alessandro Romanini e Francesco Frigeri curano la mostra Il viaggio di Mastorna, il sogno di un film messo in scena, prodotta dal Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia di Roma, il Luca Film Festival e Europa Cinema. Per rendere omaggio a Fellini e al suo film mai realizzato, la mostra propone 50 tavole esecutive delle scene del film, bozzetti dei costumi e una colonna sonora, tutte ispirate dagli appunti e dai materiali felliniani e realizzate dagli allievi del Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia. Nel 2019 alla Comédie Française, Marie Raymond realizza il spettacolo Le Voyage de G. Mastorna. Piuttosto che adattare la sceneggiatura al teatro, Marie Raymond mette in scena la storia intorno alla non realizzazione del progetto felliniano, storia che ha come protagonisti il regista e Marcello Mastroianni nei panni di Mastorna. Così come nel block notice di un regista assistiamo a una mise en abîme, perché lo spettacolo teatrale propone una ricostituzione reale e fittizia dei giorni in cui Fellini aveva lavorato negli studio e delle vicende produttive del film. E sempre nel 2019 Eugenio Capuccio realizza il documentario Fellini fine mai, prodotto per la RAI, dove tra altri soggetti abbordati si interessa anche a Mastorna. Per concludere, visto l'evidente adattologia del progetto e la sua capacità di manifestarsi in diverse arti e media, le domande centrali che potrebbe suscitare riguardano le problematiche dell'adattamento, dell'interazzialità e dell'intermedialità. Sarebbe molto interessante di vedere come si realizzano i passaggi da un testo all'altro, che relazioni si sviluppano tra le differenti arti all'interno della costellazione, che condizioni rendono possibili gli incroci tra media. E rispondere a queste domande permetterebbe di riflettere sulla eventuale presenza di un effetto sinergico emanato da questa costellazione, superiore alla somma delle sue componenti, quali complementari si chiamano e si rispondono. Finisco qua proponendo questo bel titolo, no? Fellini fine mai. Grazie mille.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vargau. Professor Kilbourn, are you connected?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay,
Yeah, I got a message.
I tried everything. I don't know what happened to me, but as long as you can hear me, I guess that's better than nothing.
Disembodied voice and all the talk about the underworld and all that, it seems almost appropriate.
My apologies. Alessio is working on it, but anyway, as long as you can hear me, I guess.
I think we've all done enough Zoom meetings and classes to be completely sympathetic with what you're going through. It happens every
got dressed
time.
up for nothing then.
Thank you very much. And so we'll open up to the Q&A section of today's session. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce Daniela Bini, who, as you know, gave her paper asynchronously, and who will also participate into the Q&A session. Daniela Bini is Professor of Italian Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Texas, Austin. She's a specialist of Italian modernism and has received numerous university fellowships, 2 National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowships, and 3 teaching awards. She's the author of numerous fundamental books on Leopardi, Carlo Michel Stetter, and Luigi Pirandello. as well as of numerous essays on various aspects of 19th and 20th century culture, including music, opera, and of course, cinema. She was the president of the American Association for Italian Studies and vice president of the International Association of Italian Language and Literature Studies. And in 2007, the president of the Italian Republic bestowed on her the title of Cavaliere Ordine della Stella della Solidarietà Italiana. Professor Bini, Professor Tavoni, Professor Minghelli, Professor Kilbourn, and Dr. Vargau are all now going to entertain questions or comments, and I will keep an eye out for those hands. Yes, Daniela, go ahead. You have to unmute. Now that's good.
Thank you. First of all, I wasn't expecting introduction. I was hoping
of course
they would be avoided since I sent my stuff. That was one of the reasons why I did that. Anyway, thank you, Luca, and I'm so happy to see you again. I had a question for Giuliana, but one problem I have with these conferences is that it takes me time. Maybe it's also my old age, but yeah, even when I was young, I need some time to sort of collect my ideas, reflect upon. So I have something to say to Giuliana, but I'm not sure, and I hope I can make sense. Okay, so bear with me. And I am very grateful, Giuliana, for your presentation, because it really helped me a great deal. I'm not certainly an expert of Fellini, and I'm not even an expert on cinema, so please be understanding. Okay, what really fascinated me in your presentation about Amarcord is this concept. I think you mentioned an ambiguous adherence to the fascism, correct? So the ambiguity that Fellini displayed or shows in the film. And that really connects me with also what I think of Fellini before other issues. The one that actually attracted me most, and I spent a little time on, is the one on of women, for example, not representation of women. And I feel that this ambiguity is central. It's a central concept in his cinematic production, because I see it a little bit as an incapacity, again, as I said to Frank when he talked about the dreams, is incapacity to cope in caricatures, to cope with reality, a sense of inferiority that he had, which I see coming out. When you talk about fascism, but I see it also, in his relationship to the figure of woman. So I don't know if I'm making any sense, but, since in my chapter on Fellini in this forthcoming book is clearly it's on dreams and drawings, but it is the way mainly that in which he faces the issue of women and how he relates himself to them. And I see the ambiguity constantly of course, in this relationship. But in a way, since I'm now connecting it with what you said, it is probably a sense of insecurity. He was ambiguous in many aspects. I don't know, Frank, maybe you should intervene, and since you are probably the greatest expert in this, group, because I really see him as a person that has a sense of inferiority. For example, Marina, I was very happy about your talk on Mastorna too. Why don't we say, for example, also that he was superstitious? That's why probably he didn't make the movie. That could be one of he was afraid. He had some hang-ups. He had some, complexes. So, I was just trying to put some things together, tied up some, issues. And, I'm very happy that if you can, explain better this, feelings or thoughts, they are coming in my mind now. But I think, your presentation was extremely helpful, Giuliana. I don't know if I make myself clear, but I'm going to shut up now.
Okay. No, totally. And, I will see my bit, but Professor Burke can jump in. I definitely see, and that is, the force of Fellini that is dealing, and just talking with the relationship with fascism right now, is dealing, like Renzi is dealing, like I would argue the old post-war culture, and so the collaborators, Pinelli, Flaiano, Pasolini, is dealing with an impairment, okay? It's like people have been impaired by this historical experience. And as all great artists, that, element of impairment became a vision, became the source of, of strength and a voice and imagination, but I think it's sort of, for me, was very interesting to see how in the relationship with Renzi in this letter, exactly this, this tension, that is a weakness, as you said, a sense of insecurity perhaps, and yet the weakness is transformed into, a representation, is an image, a powerful image, so, so fascism is, there is this sense of complicity, I mean, I see myself represented, with the passivity that Professor Burke mentioned, about Amarcord. There is the sense of passivity, and at the same time, as Renzi says, he blows up the phenomenon to such an extent that it becomes visible. So there is a representation of the culture of the 30s. There is a representation of this blindness, and there are many things I could have done in the reading. I just flashed images to you, but you're going throughout Amarcord, there is a sort of a critique of the ability to see, that really comes through. And so I find that, in the tension between even the fluidity of cinema, that sort of carries us through, and gives us a sense of salvation in the end. The fact that photography interrupts, photography sort of brings in instead a sense of mourning, a sense of, the stillness, being stuck with something that cannot be digested, and one thing that I cut out from the presentation is that amazing description that Pasolini had of going around with Fellini in the suburbs of Rome during the discussion about Knights of Cabiria, and Pasolini describes Fellini as a huge snail within which he found himself caught, and he's a snail that grabs the benzinaio, grabs La Puttana, grabs, whichever scene shows up along the way, whichever element, whatever Pasolini tells him, and brings it in and digests it, So another way of thinking of Fellini is incredible ability to digest everything. And perhaps a way to think of his relation with fascism and history is something that is undigestible and something that keeps, it's something that sticks, So I think that the notion of ambiguous adherence that he used about his relation with the metaphysical is good to think of the historical. There is a sort of an adherence that keeps, rubbing and creating, this ambiguity and this complexity, that is represented, yet at the same time is sublimated in the fluidity of cinema. So, yeah, I stop here.
Okay, shall I say something?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
I just want to thank Giuliana. Yes, you helped a lot. And I wanted just to say, so he is also complicit. I mean, he finds himself, in a way, he's also putting himself in the same, boat as everybody, the Italians during fascism, though. Okay, thank you.
I'll let Professor Burke also answer, and then Professor Kilbourn had a question. So go ahead.
Hey, okay. Yes. Thank you, Giuliana, and please call me Frank.
I will.
Great. I really enjoyed your talk. So much to think about in terms of all this. It links up with one of the things Fellini liked to say about himself is that he was voluptuously open to everything. It was the interview from like the 1960s. And there's a really nice article on Fellini and decadence in the companion to Federico Fellini, which talks about decadence and the inability to affirm, the inability to take a stance, the inability to commit. And then, of course, there is the, I am so tired of seeing all these recent documentaries on Fellini with people saying, Fellini is a provincial. You know, going back to the wonderful things that Pasolini said about Fellini, the wonderful way in which he used that phrase. But I think they all kind of speak to what Daniela you're interested in, which is that Fellini, perhaps out of insecurity, I try to stay away from psychoanalyzing the person, but still, you know, what you're saying I think is really true. But there was something fundamental to Fellini's character about not committing, about staying in a position where he could remain open, and for that reason, you know, the left never liked him because he wasn't taking obviously political stands. On the other hand, his openness enabled him to see connections that ideologues don't see because they just have their way of imposing their ideology on film. Fellini, instead, the openness that he had, and let's call it the insecurity if we want, but the unwillingness to take a strong position also allowed him to absorb and reflect and represent in ways that are much more complex than simplistic political films, et cetera. So I think it's all wrapped up in a kind of dynamic, and the downside is that Fellini deforms. The upside is that he stays open and he shows us things that we wouldn't normally be able to see, and he's able to experience things that an average person with preconceptions wouldn't be able to see as well. So that's just sort of off the top of my head how I would respond.
Professor Kilbourn, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and thanks. Apologize again for being a blank. This is a question for Giuliana. I found your presentation really thought-provoking, and I think this is maybe what you were saying, but I thought maybe you could address it more directly. In terms of Fellini's engagement in a film like Amarcord with Italy's fascist past, can what you call memory as imagination be separated finally from memory as witnessing? Doesn't a film like Amarcord sort of illustrate this fluidity and the indifference to objective veridicality that distinguishes memory from something like history proper? I think this is what you were sort of getting at, but I thought you could address that, you know, more directly. Or maybe you weren't saying that.
Well, no. I mean, the thing is, we sort of tend to separate memory from history. What Renzi is calling for is witnessing and the use of autobiography, interestingly. So the use of memory, personal and collective, as a means to develop a new discourse about fascism. You know, so the sort of the starting point is plenty has been said. The historians are very learned and insightful, you know, so we know about historical fascism, and yet we fail to remember fascism. Okay, so, and I think that there was quite an interesting dialogue, you know, between Fellini and Renzi with these two notions of memory. They're not mutually exclusive, you know, but memory as understood by Renzi is really a working through, is really an analytical tool, you know, because it's has an affective dimension, but is sort of even the autobiographical, the personal, the affective is used as a critical tool of analysis. So in the end, do we want really keep it separate. I mean, there is sort of a crossing of categories, you know. Memory becomes a tool to understand history, and Fellini does use memory to engage the historical. And the question is more of memory as an image, memory as a look, as is developed in Amarcord, versus memory as an act that is self-conscious, and that is something that we have rarely seen in post-war Italian culture. Yeah, so that would be my answer. If
I think that's a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Luca, if I may,
Absolutely. Go ahead,
yes. Grazie. I also would like to thank Giuliana Minghelli for this wonderful talk. Truly, non è un complimento, è proprio vero. I particularly like this idea that you have tried in such a brief amount of time. Mi rendo conto. And I also think, like you, that what Fellini is trying to do in Amarcord, exactly as you said, is to actually by of a picture and the movement of a process of narration.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole meaning of Amarcord and his position towards fascism, perché è importante ricordarsi quando ha voluto fare questo film. È molto strano la data in cui lui decide di fare un film come Amarcord, no?
Mm-hmm.
E questo spiega, forse, can explain also the reluctancy, no, to put 30 years, almost 30 years between the end of fascism and himself, and the complexity of addressing the issue of being a fascist or being an Italian during fascism, rather, and what fascism has done to our conscience, to their conscience, and to their way of being in the world. So I find your paper particularly interesting because it has working on this idea of photography versus film, as manages to activate a different kind of thinking about the film, about Fellini's position towards that particular time in their lives, in our lives. And also, I think, about the very process of filmmaking, because what sometimes escaped our attention and escapes attention is that Fellini was not so much interested in the product, but in the process, and he was interested in a twofold process: communication and signification. So he wanted to communicate, and the act of making a film is an act of communication. But come sappiamo dal punto di vista semiotico, la comunicazione e significazione, sicché he was pretty much aware of the fact that in the making of a movie, he was also constructing a meaning. He was constructing the process of signification. And this is why I think that your analysis is so interesting in regard to Amarcord, because you have somehow led us in between, inside this process, you know, in which he tries, on the one hand, to communicate, if you wish, and on the other, however, to construct a different kind of signification, different kind of meaning. Non era facile, no, parlare del fascismo, non è mai stato facile per, and it was difficult for an artist like him because he didn't have a strong political stand.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I find that most of his cinema is political in a larger sense. But at the same time, it was difficult for him because it is easier to take a stand if your ideological perspective is well defined and you have a clear-cut political position, ideological position. For him, he had to find it. And because for him, making a movie is an act of self-finding, of self-digging, into his own conscience, I think your analysis is very, very useful, davvero, grazie. Molto, molto utile, molto bella, grazie, davvero.
Grazie, grazie.
Giuliana, do you want to answer, and then we have Frank as a...
I don't...
No, it's not necessary.
Yeah, I see, it's more of a
question. Yeah.
But I just wanted to give you a chance to respond. Frank, I think you had a question next, or a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say to Professor Tavoni, I really enjoyed your talk, and I really enjoyed sort of this Dantificazione of Fellini. You really put it in perspective where you can and where you can't really talk legitimately about the relationship between Fellini and Dante. I thought that was fabulous, and also placing Fellini in a sense more in the context of Jung and Kafka. I really, really, really enjoyed your talk. It just made so much sense.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. An important scholar, Fellini scholar like you, is for me a very authoritative approval of my of my paper, which you may consider professional on the side of Dante, but absolutely an amateur on the side of Fellini. So I'm very pleased that you appreciated it.
I see from the chat that Elisa Brilli had a question or a comment. Elisa?
Yeah, sorry, I'm showing myself. Hello. Hello, hi. So I wanted to follow up on Professor Burke's remark about Tavoni's paper in McGill too. That's a question from more from the side of Dante than from the side of Fellini, who I do not know very well. I was intrigued by the connection you made about vision, which is an element so present in both cases. So Dante's one and Fellini's one. At the same time, it's true that something that seems to really oppose the two conceptions is the position of women. But it's true that in Dante's studies now the hegemony of Beatrice is somehow questioned. So we are reflecting more and more on the presence of other figures who are there in all the works by Dante. So I'm thinking about the Rime, but also the Pargletta, the Petrosa, and so on. So my question is that possible that a reader like Fellini was able to perceive this series of somehow problems which are so present in Dante's work and of which we are getting aware only now, because for a long time we stuck to the myth of Beatrice and somehow able to how would I put it, to deploy the richness and also the contradictions that were present in Dante's work.
Fine. Thank you, Elisa. Well, I think that Fellini might have realized this more hidden side of Dante's poetry and Dante's vision of women. He might, if he had been informed about I mean, the literary facts that you mentioned, that is the Rime Petrose, but as I quoted him, he always repeated that he was very ignorant. That he was very ignorant. And,
we can trust him about that?
Well, as far as minor literary works of this kind are concerned, yes, I think we should trust him. We should trust him. Of course, in Dante, there is an amount of eroticism absolutely out of the still novistic perspective that we are accustomed to. but it is not that evident. The more usual texts. No, this is not true. In the Divine Comedy, there are moments of eroticism quite clear, but no, I don't think that that Fellini was reached by this kind of information.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments?
Luca, if
Yes.
I could.
Go ahead, Juliana. Yep.
Is Jackie.
Oh, sorry. Juliana raised her hand as you.
Oh, I'm
spoke.
sorry.
No,
Juliana, would you like to go?
Go ahead.
It's just a short comment, and it's for Professor Tavoni. I enjoyed his talk as well, and I was just thinking how, I mean, if you're still working on this essay, you mentioned at the end the influence of Kafka's Il Processo, but what I was thinking more about was America, Kafka's first novel, where you have this trip, this, you know, fantastic trip, arrival to America. There is a sort of a descent to an underworld of a sort, you know, so perhaps that might be another point of references beyond the Processo. That's something that I thought while you were presenting. I don't know if...
Thank you very much. This is a precious suggestion, and I remember I saw America quoted in Fellini bibliography that I read over the last weeks. So, but I'm not a specialist at all. What I said about the trial being an evident source or point of reference for Viaggio di Mastorna is just because it is so evident. I mean, it is so evident, and it is confirmed by the words of Fellini himself that I have quoted. But in addition, this reference to America, I think, is very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Jackie.
Oh, well, first of all, thanks to everybody for just a terrific panel. I really enjoyed it. And I love, of course, being selfish. I love the reference to Machiste. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to, you know, there are so many, I want to encourage you to see the restored version, if you can, of Machiste all'Inferno, because it has, here I can actually show you a couple of really great color plates, because it really does help evoke, here's some from, sorry, self-publicity, but this is mostly based publicity for the Museo Nazionale del Cinema in their restoration. And you could see some of the beautiful screenshots from their restoration. But this idea, I have so many thoughts, and you know, this was really thought-provoking panel, and I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with this, but the idea of Machiste and Renzi, right? The two are very interconnected with this notion of the idea of and also in Amarcord with Mussolini, right? And Mussolini is Divo. And he has a whole section in the essay talking about Mussolini as a star and his comparison to other actors, in particular Emilio Gione. So I just love the kind of interplay here between the two talks. And I want to see if you could further elaborate, Giuliana, a little bit on Fellini and photography. It's something that I'm interested in, obviously, from my paper yesterday. And we talk about, and I'd like to hear other people as well, about collaborations, right, with Fellini and writers and Fellini and theorists and psychiatrists and others. And I'd love to hear more about, if anybody knows about his collaboration with photographers. I think some of it was mentioned, but also this idea of that kind of frozenness versus fluidity, which you talk about, and the way in which it's so it calls further attention to the self-consciousness and the self-reflexive nature of Fellini's films. So I don't know, I'm just kind of all over the place here because this discussion has stimulated so many different ideas in my head. But thank you all for a great panel.
Thank you, Jack. Anyone would like to respond? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Renzi's analysis of the impact of you know, the vaudeville of the 20s and machiste and all this cinematic imaginary on the creation of the Mussolini's persona is really, you know, insightful. And he wrote early on, you know, on the topic. So definitely there is a connection between Machiste and Renzi. At first I was like, Machiste and Renzi. No, there is a connection. For photography, there is a lot of work to do. Work has been done, particularly with La Dolce Vita, and how sort of La Dolce Vita, you know, came out of truly a photographic album that Fellini put together about Il Cristo dei Pescatori and you know, the miracle, you know. I mean, all these various episodes of La Dolce Vita are episodes taken from the rotocalchi of the time. And you know, there is this description of Fellini's studio at the time as like a wall of photographs from various rotocalchi, you know, that eventually, you know, poured in and made the meats and bone of the film. So clearly there is a strong connection there. As far as you know, he worked together with, you know, the paparazzi, but he worked together with photographers as on the stage set, you know, as you were, you know, talking about yesterday, and the extent of that collaboration, you know, has been, you know, sort of looked into with works on Secchiaroli particularly, but Franco Pina a little bit less, and a lot of the photographers were not even credited, you know, so it's a sort of a murky territory to explore. When the Fellini conference came out, I had two presentations. One was this one, and the other one was the relationship between Fellini and William Klein. In fact, I thought, can you participate both to the Toronto and the Roma conference? Because I have two papers, you know. But there too, you know, is a very interesting, you know, interaction and exchange, you know, of, you know, the look of Night of Cabiria, I think, can be put very in close contact with the aesthetic, you know, saturated blacks and whites of William Klein photography. So there is, you know, a wealth of you know, connections and, you know, even, let's say, materially. And then at a theoretical level, we can go on quite a while exactly about this double dimension of the insistence of the image, as Atom Egoyan was talking about yesterday, that you have with the photographic, versus the fluidity of Fellini's, you know, vision. And there's something there that is important, that is really worth exploring. So I would stop here.
Thank you. And I see that it's almost 20 to 1, so we have gone over a lot of time a little bit. So I think we can bring the Q&A and the session to a conclusion. Although, if any of you want to continue this conversation, you can use the breakout room feature and continue the conversation. I just wanted to thank again our speakers in person and asynchronous for today. And just to conclude, a reminder that our conference continues on Friday at 9:30. We will have, on Friday the 10th of October, we will have a keynote by Veronica Pravadelli and papers by Manuela Geri, Andrew Monti, Eleonora Sartoni, and Federico Pacchioni. So see you all at 9:30 next Friday, and thanks again for for a great panel, a great discussion. More next weekend.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Grazie a tutti, arrivederci.